Can you hear me? Am I not coming through?
No, we can hear you. I can hear you.
Okay, someone in the chat is saying that they cannot hear. Okay, so I'm going to assume everything's okay. Um, thank you. Thank you, Sarah. First, I just want to say thank you to Politics and Prose. For me, this is a very special event because I sort of have special connections both to Politics and Prose and to Diane Johnson, which I will explain super, super briefly. When I was 19, I'm from New York. I spent the summer in DC as a research intern at a think tank. And it was a horrible, grueling job, and I hated it. And I was the editorial intern, and I thought this meant that I would be writing and doing interesting things, and instead it was sort of a nightmare. I, every day after work, would go to Politics and Prose at their old location. It was insanely hot, and I would arrive there drenched in sweat in my sort of horrible, like Ann Taylor work clothes, and just sit there and read for the rest of the night. And I've always thought of it as one of my favorite bookstores in the world. I just love it, and I love your new location too. So I'm so thrilled to be here. So thank you for having us. Okay, so I think anyone that's here knows who Diane Johnson is. So I'm just going to speak a little bit about her. We know from Chelsea's wonderful introduction that she's been basically nominated for every national award. She's the author of 18 books, 12 novels, and she is, and now I'm about to cry, incontrovertibly, I think, the greatest novelist of her generation. She's my favorite. Oh my God, I'm crying. She's my favorite novelist. I've read all her books multiple times, and they've meant so much to me. I'm so sorry. This is, people always say, oh, it's an honor, but for me, it truly is an honor and a pleasure to be in conversation with Diane today. I also will just quickly say that I don't know if Diane remembers this, but I was her fellow at the Sewanee Writers Conference years ago, and I was so scared of her that I could barely talk to her at the time. And so hopefully today I'll be a little less scared. Okay, so I'm going to say nothing else except that, and Diane's going to read to you from Lorna Mott Comes Home, her magnificent new novel, and then we will talk. And the one thing I just want to say is I suspect that a lot of you have questions, and it's really good for me as the moderator to know how many questions there are. So please start typing them in even now so that I can gauge how many questions there are and know when to stop our conversation so we can get to as many of your questions as possible. So, okay, thank you guys so much. And Diana, I can't wait to hear you read.
Thank you, Joanna. Thank you. That was the nicest. I had a tear myself. Lorna Mott asked Monsieur Joss to stop his taxi so she could walk a little way along the road above the graveyard of Pont-les-Puits. The whole village was talking this morning about how, in the darkness during last night's heavy rains, the cemetery had dislodged itself and, with the stealth of a nocturnal predator, slid 500 meters downhill, where the astonished citizens this morning had discovered a huge sticky hillock of treacherous clay, burst coffins, broken stones, corpses, and bones. Only the oldest gravestones remain standing with unseeing dignity above the sacrilegious chaos. It was Lorna's last day in Pont-les-Puits, and she would leave with this ominous sight in mind as a kind of cautionary reminder of consequences unforeseen. Her departure, escape as she was thinking of it, was both impulsive and planned. Once she was safely on the train to Lyon, she could admit that subconsciously she'd been planning for a while for a future in California without her husband, Amadou. They needed some time apart, and things she'd been doing could be construed as unconscious strategies to accomplish this. For instance, recently publishing her collected art lectures and accepting a lecture appearance in Bakersfield, California, where she was headed now. Bakersfield was hardly at the level of places she lectured before her marriage, but going there was a toe in the water of her return to professional life. She'd been thrilled with the invitation out of the blue from Bakersfield, and it had been the impetus she had needed to take up her professional life again, revive, expand. These were gestures toward autonomy, surely, even if she hadn't thought of them this way. In these her middle years, as people called the late 50s, early 60s, she was too old to cry about leaving. Armand Lou was her second husband. She'd been through marital difficulties before. Why did she feel so near to a well of sobs as she neared the station? There are times you feel you've made a mess of your life. That was the sum of it. The harder to bear when you think of yourself as a basically competent person, even an accomplished one. 2 failed marriages, and so late in the day, argued the opposite, incompetence. But she told herself, marriage does not define your life. I can stop there and go on.
Thank you so much. It was so exciting to hear you read that.
That was the beginning. I should have said that. That is from the beginning, the very beginning, first page.
And yeah, and we follow Lorna as she returns home to San Francisco. And, so I have a million questions for you. It was really hard to narrow them down. But maybe I'll just start at the beginning, which is maybe because the book came out so recently, I don't know what percentage of people in the audience have read it. And I wonder if you could just tell everyone sort of what it's about.
Sure. As the first paragraph suggests, she's a woman in her, I don't say, but sort of late 50s, middle 60s. And she has been married for 20 years to Armand Lou, and they lived in a little village in France, in southern France. But he is a wildly unfaithful skirt chaser. And so she's finally just had it. She finds someone's underpants in the glove compartment, and she said, that's it. And she's leaving. And we follow her journey back to San Francisco. She tries to put her life back together, rejoin her old profession of art lecturer. She has 4 grown children, and she finds herself now in the middle of their lives, and they're even grandchildren, and some of their lives come into play. So it's a big cast of characters, and it's a family story.
And
I won't tell you where she ends up.
I'll move on to my biggest question for you in a second, but one thing that I loved so much about it, and that I've loved about all your novels, like even going back to your first novels, is that Lorna Mott is so much about money and the sort of economic forces at play in all your characters' lives. So Armand Lou has also, kind of ruined their finances, right? Because as he gets older, his mistresses, are less. They're
more expensive and younger. Yeah.
Yes. So that's a component of her leaving, that his affairs, are having a material effect on her life, so she can no longer kind of overlook them, right?
That's right. They've had to rent out their house, and now they're living above the bakery. Armand Lou is living above the bakery, and Lorna leaves. My late and beloved friend Allison Lurie read the manuscript, and she said, very kind of disapprovingly, but it's all about money. All the people are so concerned about money. And I had to think about that, because I would have said it's quite a realistic novel. And so in fact, people's concerns are about money. If they're, love, yes, of course, child, parent-child relations, everything. But a lot of those things boil down to money too. So in a way, it's a look at the financial situation in 2008, which was a moment of the great crash. And there is some economics involved, absolutely. especially because Lorna's first husband, who's called Lorna Mott, has remarried to a .com millionaire. And she's actually a person in another of my novels, but Amy Hawkins, and she has a lot of money. And so Ran and Amy and their child, they have a 15-year-old child, have plenty of money. And then all of Lorna's first batch of Ran's children are struggling. So is that a source of family tension? How do they get around that, beyond it?
Yeah, I mean, I kept thinking about, my other favorite novelist, I have a bunch of friends tonight and they're all probably laughing because they've heard me talk about this so much. My other favorite novelist is Alison Laurie. And
really?
And I read that at the end of the book and thought, oh, but that was so much of what I loved about the novel. And it made me think about how, I mean, many of your previous novels are very much about like what having money means for a woman alone, for instance. Like I feel like The Shadow Knows is very much about that in a certain way, right? And
yeah.
And there's a way in which Lorna's life is so precarious. She arrives in the US thinking that she can pick up this career that she had 20 years before. She has an inkling that it might not be possible, that the world has changed a little bit, but she really doesn't understand the vast changes that have overtaken San Francisco and what San Francisco real estate is like. And her situation, I felt afraid for her as a woman alone. And I felt that was what you were trying to sort of get at. Like,
yes, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. I think it's just a side of real life that doesn't often get, written about or taken for granted. Money magically appears in people's lives or whatever, but of course it doesn't. And any woman who leaves her husband has to think about the next, step, which is how she's going to support herself. So that was important to me.
yeah.
And I have to say, I remember being a young divorcee with 4 small children, and that's how I became aware of its importance, I think.
Wow. So can I ask you a little bit about that?
Yeah.
Yeah. When was this? And were you in California at the time?
I was in California. It was kind of the story told in The Shadow Knows.
Oh.
But in what doesn't come into The Shadow Knows is I went to England with my children because I was working on a graduate degree, and I worked on my dissertation and had a little grant from Woodrow Wilson. God bless the Woodrow Wilson Foundation and the American Association of University Women. How nice to be able to give credit all this time to all these people that help struggling young mothers.
Yeah. Well, can I ask you a little bit more? I'm so curious about this. So I hope this is okay to ask. Like, did you get married quite young and have children early?
Yes, I got married when I was 19 and,
Oh my
started
God.
having children. So, yeah. And so, so my children were, and they came along rapidly. So I had 4 children within 6 years. And those were busy days, as you can imagine.
And were you in school at the time?
Yes, I was in graduate school. It was kind of a way of getting out of the house. While the children were in nursery school, I was taking courses at UCLA. And if you take enough courses, you get a PhD. So that's what I was doing. And
in literature or?
Yeah, in Victorian literature.
Wow. And so, I mean, having read The Shadow Knows, I mean, was it terrifying to be alone with 4 small children in a certain way?
Well, it kind of was. And in The Shadow Knows, there's a rather domineering and crazy housekeeper, Osella, she's called in the novel. And she was really in my life. I mean, she really was. I had this babysitter, housekeeper, while I went to my classes and stuff. And she did go crazy in the way that was described in the novel. So, so that was terrifying. Yes, some of the terrifying details though I added just to make it worse. Yeah,
It's fiction, so
yeah, it's fiction. Yeah, like the dead cat on the lawn that was made up. It happened to someone else, and I heard about it and thought how scary that would be.
that is terrifying. And at the time, I mean, was there sort of, did you feel judged for being divorced with small kids in LA in that
Yes,
moment?
absolutely. Because, well, mostly judged as being crazy, because what kind of woman would cut herself loose with four small children? So I think people judged it as super irresponsible. And when I got to England, I thought I'd rent a house with my Woodrow Wilson grant. And I found that I had to make up a husband and a story. That is, I had to say, my husband is coming later, but he sent me along to get the children in school, and he'll be along later.
Wow. And
And that's what it took to be able to be rented to. And yeah, we had kind of a marvelous year in England. I don't know
wow.
if the children would agree, but I think it did wonders for their education.
And how old were your kids when you wrote your first novel?
Well, so let's see. I don't know. I was writing. They were probably at 10, 11, 12 when I started to write up The Shadow Knows. Yeah. I wrote it in 1972. I can't believe that, but that's when it was. Because we were back in England with my new husband, and life had settled down. And yeah, 72 is when I wrote it, and it would have happened in 68.
Yeah, I'm asking just because I mean,
Yeah,
I just
that's the
thinking back on
chronology.
all your novels, there's a lot of divorce in them. And like, not to overshare, but I myself left my husband with two small children about 8 years
Oh,
ago. And I found myself rereading all of your novels alone at night in a sort of
well, I
makeshift
hope they
apartment.
gave you comfort in that, that things usually work out.
They did. They really
Yeah,
did. And they also, I think, I had felt that life was kind of like an Edith Wharton novel. And if I got divorced, the world was going to judge me so harshly. And they were kind of normalized divorce for me
yeah,
in a certain way.
yeah.
Oh, and
Yes, I don't know if it was the case for you, but I was the first person to ever get divorced in my family. And it's more common now, but this was in the 60s, and it was nobody, in my family had been divorced. So
yeah, it was the same for me. Yeah,
yeah,
it was
yeah,
the same for me. But yeah, and you see this a bit in Lorna Mott, that she's thinking back on when she left Ran and everyone judged her so harshly, but what they didn't know was that he was drunk and abusive and horrible to her. And even there's the insinuation that even those who knew that didn't care. They thought that she still should have stayed with him.
yeah. Yes, that was the interpretation that I intended. But of course, by now in this novel, Ran is a fine, upstanding. He's a doctor, and no longer drinks and so on. I mean, everything is fine, and he and Amy have a happy marriage. So everyone is. There are no villains in this novel, actually.
Yeah,
Did you feel? I mean, did you feel that there were any villains?
I didn't, but I do feel like Ran, I felt incredible rage toward him. Just, and this is something that you started to talk about a little bit, that he, as you said, so for everyone out there, so Ran is married, this very, very, very vastly wealthy woman who is the main character of, I'm going to mispronounce this, L'Affaire, the third novel in Diane's Paris trilogy, and who's a sort of Silicon Valley entrepreneur. And he's now incredibly wealthy. And basically, he won't use any of his money to help his children. His children are all grown-ups, essentially like in middle age at this point. And they're all in dire financial straits and also in dire emotional straits in a certain way.
Yeah, they kind of need their mother, as Lorna finds out.
Yeah, they really do. And I felt like he, the way that he behaved, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago seemed fine. I remember people in my family, my own parents actually behaving this way. But now I felt like, oh God, this is not okay. This kind of emotional distance from your kids. And also this, the thing that I found so horrible is that, so for everyone out there, I don't want to spoil too much for you, but basically there's a generous gift made to someone. And then he has a lovely, smart, kind granddaughter who asks him for a very small amount of money. And instead he suggests that she work as a waitress at a charity event, whatever it is, like a $10,000, $20,000 a table charity event. He gets her a job as a caterer instead of just giving her the, $4,000 she needs. And it's kind of horrible.
That is kind of horrible, isn't it? Yeah, I didn't mean it. Maybe it's a bit of a villain, but I think he thought, young people need to work and so on. Yeah, that's true. That was bad, the way he treated Julie, but she kind of accepted that ethic too of, working and.
Yeah,
it's
true. I wanted to ask you, about Lorna Mott. Are the sort of events in this, like as in returning to San Francisco and finding it so vastly changed, and returning to the US and sort of questioning your national identity, as Lorna does a lot, and I have some more questions about this. Is this drawn from your life? I mean, you lived in Paris for more than 20 years?
20, 30 years, yeah.
Yeah.
Part of the year. So in fact, I do the going back to America once a year. So so it's kind of the sum of the coming back each summer to spend the summer in California. And even at yearly intervals, the changes are noticeable. So it's set in 2008, as I guess I said, and the reason for that is I didn't really think I could deal with the Trump era changes. That was too much, too much of a load for this novel, I think. So it was in a more neutral but flourishing economic moment. Well, there was a crash, but then things were, basically okay.
Yeah, or well, I feel like the crash actually is sort of this lurking backdrop. It reminded me so much of The Age of Innocence in a way that.
Oh yeah, I hadn't thought of that. That's right. That's absolutely. Yeah.
And you kind of think like, oh God. I mean, you really definitely weave in these little bits of what's to come.
Yeah. For the metaphorical weight of a crash and of financial irresponsibility that was, the watchword.
Yeah, people taking out $3 million mortgages for
Yes, exactly.
Ending up with this vastly
one of the characters does that, we should say. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, one of the questions that I was thinking about as I read it a second time preparing for this, I was this question of sort of generational differences. And I don't know why I'm talking so much about my own family in this conversation, but hopefully everyone will forgive me. But my mother is a little bit older than you, and she's 91, and I have a sister who's 20 years older than I am. So she, is more sort of the age of the kids in the book. And
Yeah.
and I saw some of the differences in outlook, very much like in the kind of clash between my mother and my sister. And I started thinking so much about like what defines a generation, like as in Lorna is an incredibly kind of hardworking person in a way, and a sort of like this is such a cheesy term, but she's kind of like a go-getter who kind of gets things done, and she's a serious thinker and has, her mind is kind of always going. But her kids, one of her sons is a sort of entrepreneur, who's made a lot of money, sort of. It's not clear. Like there might be a bit of like a kind of shell game pyramid scheme going on. We don't know for sure. But her other two kids, are kind of, there's a way in which they're kind of purposeless and they're a little bit lost. And I wondered, if you were thinking about those kind of generational differences. It's like, why did
Yeah.
these turn out this way with these super successful parents?
Well, I think that was true for a lot of people who were young, the age of Peggy and
Yes.
The kids in the book. They were 60s kids. And so there's something kind of, at the time, there was something kind of not encouraged about go-getting. It wasn't even considered very nice.
Mm-hmm.
And so you had to go to college, but then really, except for people who had real career goals, there was just a lot of drifting and,
like there was more of a focus on experimentation in life and enjoying life. And it seems like it causes Lorna a lot of frustration and sadness, particularly with her daughter Peggy. And did you experience any of this with your own children? Is that too personal to talk about?
Like every mother, the children went in and out of phases that I did or didn't worry about. It seemed like with 4, there was always somebody who was on top of the world and somebody, who was kind of searching. And so, as a mother, it doesn't stop. And,
Yeah. And are your kids all in the Bay Area, like the kids in the book?
No, none of them are. The youngest boy, which would be, I suppose, equivalent to Kurt in the novel, lives in Japan, not Thailand. And so there are equivalences. One person who's made the dog collars, one daughter lives in North Carolina. My daughter Darcy lives in Washington, so is a person who comes to politics and prose. And Amanda, another daughter, lives here in Paris.
Oh, that's so nice.
And so, everyone's accounted for. One son lives in Santa Cruz. I'm including my stepchildren because we had 7 altogether.
As well, you should.
Yeah.
That's so. I have so many questions for you. I'm going to limit myself to a couple more and then move to questions from the audience. I'm just trying to think of what the most important ones are. I think of you as this is strange, I suppose, because your novels are so much about the life. Okay, I'm actually going to change my question because this other question is more important. Forgive me. Okay, so in Le Divorce, Izzy sort of thinks about what it means to be an American. Like if you're an American who lives abroad for an extended period of time, she wonders, are you still, I'm paraphrasing, obviously, she wonders, are you still an American or do you become something else? You're obviously never going to be, for instance, French, but are you a kind of hybrid creature? And I thought about that a lot reading this book because so much of it is about, Lorna comes home thinking to herself at the beginning, I'm American. and I need to be in America. And she says this to people, even though she a little bit doubts herself. What do you think about this? This is such a theme of your books.
I think you always go on being an American, but that living abroad is a really valuable experience for all kinds of reasons. And so ideally, it puts you in touch with your roots and, the whole basis of our culture, which is basically, I mean, it's probably totally politically incorrect to say that, but it is basically Western European. And so that's just what it is. And so, yeah, I think you get changed by living abroad, but there's some basic core of Americanness that you always will have. And yeah, but there's a sentence in the book: you have to be tough to live in America. And I think that's one of the lessons that people learn when they go abroad.
Right. And do you think that's part of what's happening in the book, that she comes back and realizes maybe she's not quite as tough?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, a little shocked by the realities. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Definitely the healthcare system is a huge shock to her.
Yeah. Yeah. For instance. Yeah. And the rents and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. The rents, definitely. And then I wanted to ask you, I'm going to jump to two other subjects. Like, I was talking about this with a friend yesterday. I think of you as a very Californian novelist, despite the fact that you've written all these novels about Paris. And I wondered what you think about this. Like, I feel like there are actually quite few true sort of novelists of California. Like, obviously there's Joan Didion. I love Alison Laurie's novel, The Nowhere City, but she's obviously an Easterner writing about
LA. Looking at it from the point of view. Yeah, well, it's true. I was a great admirer of the novels of Carolyn C.
Oh, I love Carolyn C. Yes.
Yeah, and she was a friend and died much too soon. But she wrote some wonderful Californian novels, and she was more Californian than I, because she was born there like Joan. And I only went there in my late teens. So.
Oh, and before that, you were in the Midwest.
Yeah.
Yeah. And my 5-year-old child would say, like Barbie, actually, who moves to Malibu from Wisconsin. But I guess the thing that was interesting to me, I mean, maybe you are such a wonderful chronicler of California because you are a bit of an outsider.
I think that's part of it, yeah.
It seems like California in your novels, there's a strange way in which it's often, I mean, not in the early novels, but in the later novels, it's kind of contrasted with France, and that it's this place in which, I don't know, kind of anything can happen, in which kind of society is much less codified. It's almost like the Uber America kind of, right?
Well, yes, I would agree with you. Things that happen in California will happen later in other parts of America, but they happen first in California, it seems.
Yes.
I can't think of a good example, but yeah, the fashion for something, or.
Definitely, especially LA. And my last question for you, and I have so many more, and I just want to move on to audience questions, is I wanted to ask you about how, like, the importance of literary friendship in your life. And now I'm going to start crying again. When I discovered that my two favorite novelists were best friends, I was, shocked and delighted because I saw so much crossover between your work. And you mentioned Carolyn C., another favorite novelist of mine. And I wondered, like, what role literary friendship has played in your life and the creation of your novels. Like, were your friends readers? Did you discuss your work with them?
Yes, absolutely. Allison was really so important to me, and she I was living in Los Angeles, kind of isolated. I didn't know any writers. And somebody said, oh, you should meet Allison. She's writing novels too, and introduced us. This was probably in the 1950s. Yeah, I mean, and she was the young wife of a teaching assistant or assistant professor at UCLA, and I was a graduate student. And so we became friends at that point. And then since then, we've never lived in the same place, but she read all my novels, and we would meet in England. We had an apartment together in England for a while, and then I would go visit her. She bought my half, and all those complicated arrangements. But anyway, a very long, maybe 60-year friendship, and reading each other's work and making comments, and including, that's why I sent Lorna to Allison, last year. And I was kind of, she really didn't approve of it in that, as I mentioned, she thought it was a little mercenary, or I don't know. She didn't think, maybe she was, she was not well, and she was soon would die. Maybe she'd moved on to a more spiritual plane. I don't know. I like to think that anyway.
Let's hope. Yeah.
Let's hope. Yeah.
I have a lot more questions for you, but I'm going to see what people in the audience are asking. Oh, this is such a great question. This was actually one of my questions, so I'm so excited. So someone has asked if you could talk about your writing process. And I have one specific thing to add to this, which is I found out yesterday from Sarah that I did not know this, that you co-wrote the screenplay for The Shining, and that writing screenplays affected your writing process. And so I wonder if you could talk in general about it, but also about this kind of overlap and like what you
specifically with The Shining. Yeah, well, I can explain how The Shining influenced me. I really wrote it, but I was overseen very closely with lots and lots of consultations by Stanley Kubrick, for whom I was writing it. And he wanted us to make a list of scenes like you would do for a film, and then fill in the scenes as it went along. And I discovered that this was really applicable to novel writing too. And this led to a kind of belief in the outline, which Stanley believed in. And I've come to believe in as a way of saving yourself a lot of missteps as you're trying to plot out your novel or organize it. So part of my process is a pre-process before I actually start to write. And then when I start to write and know what the scenes will be and who the characters are, it's much easier to plunge in, and that's my process pretty much. Once writing the actual words and scenes, I think it goes more smoothly, knowing what's going to happen tomorrow, sort of. But things change also, and you have to be open to the changes that are going to change, to alter the way the novel goes.
Wow. So how long when you say an outline, is this like a huge, robust outline where you kind of lay out the whole plot of the book and all the characters and sort of?
It can't be that detailed, because that would probably prevent you from making any discoveries as you go along.
Yes.
Yeah. No, you want it to be a little bit loose, a little bit baggy, and then it's mostly a way of knowing who the characters are, the arc for each of them, maybe, because it might change. The ending, lots of writers say they know the ending, when they start. That's not, alas, been true of me, but but I have a view of the ending. I mean, you can always kill everyone off at the end or something, but if that's not your plan,
That's very
you
Stanley
have the
Kubrick
power
of
to
you.
do it. So I think, to simplify what I'm trying to say is, yes, outline, not too detailed, showing the arc of the narrative and allowing you to think about the parts. So
Wow, I love
how am I going to begin it? How am I going to end it? What does happen in Milwaukee when the characters go, what is the significance of that lost suitcase, whatever. The more you can think about it in advance, I think, the better.
So how long do you spend thinking about it in advance before you sort of sit down and draft the novel?
Well, I think, it can be some months, really, from getting the idea to kind of allowing it to develop. It can be some months or a year. Sometimes you have an idea for years. I'm writing a book now that I've thought of since I wrote Mrs. Meredith in whenever that was, 70. A character that I encountered then related to her. And now I'm only now getting around to writing this. It's not a novel though. It's sort of a treatise, but
Wow,
it's been on my mind.
I can't wait.
So yeah. um, I think that, so short answer, some months of thinking about it, a couple of years to write it.
And someone has a follow-up question about this, asking how much research you do for novels, and also like what your daily writing life is like. Like, do you sit down every day and write all day? Is it less structured than that?
Much less structured, much because, at one period I had children at home, and so nothing could be, there's no possibility of a writing ritual. And as a
I
result,
know.
I've never really, yes, exactly. And so you just learn to catch some time on the fly. And that's pretty much remained my, now I could spend hours, but also I'm very fidgety and I like to do other things. And so I just wait till something is kind of ripe and then I sit down and write it. And then,
And another person, here's another research question. Someone, Miriam asks, how much research you did for this book, and if so, what kind?
this book did not require as much research as some, because so much of it is taken sort of from my life and my family situation. So the only thing were details of the economy in the 80s. I had to look up all that. Housing prices, the right names of streets, all the things, the literal details that you have to get right, because if you don't, someone will write you a mean letter, that inevitably. The squirrel's nest is not on Polk Street. It is on, Post or it was some of,
Yeah.
so yeah.
Okay. And I'm just trying to get rid of some of the answered questions. Oh, this is a wonderful question. Someone who does not name him or herself says, I haven't read all your books. I need to remedy that, but I notice an appreciation for art in the ones I have, which is very, very true. Art plays a central role in a number of your books. And also like the decorative arts as well. There's I love that element of certain novels, like certain characters' interest in sort of more decorative arts. Anyway, can you talk about art in your work and in your life?
Yes, it's true. I mean, I hadn't thought of that as being a recurring thing, but I am interested in art. My mother was an artist and went to the Art Institute of Chicago. And my husband's father was a painter. There's a lot of art in the family, in other words. And I myself have been taking a drawing class next door to my apartment at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. So that's been fun, though exhausting. Yeah, so art plays a big role in my life, and its metaphorical significance is very useful in novels too, because it often can carry a lot of meaning.
Like how so? Tell us a little more.
Well, like in The Divorce, which the painting becomes the focus of a family disagreement, and then of some of the many events that happen in the book. And a symbol, because there's dissension between the French family, or French people consider that it's a French painting, it should stay in France, and the American family that believes that because it's theirs, it's theirs. Symbolizing the two countries, the two continents, and I don't know, any kind of central symbol in a work has to carry a lot of weight, and it would be different for different books, but it's, I don't know, I hadn't thought of, somebody asked me once why furniture played such a role in my books, and I hadn't really been aware of that at all, but then I thought about it, and yes, there's a lot about sofas and things, and so a lot of it just is, it reflects the life of a woman who has to decorate her houses and
it's true. There is
decide on
a
the
lot
new
of
sofa.
porcelain and silverware, and
Yeah, exactly.
yeah. There are two questions that are quite similar, so I'm going to sort of give you both of them because they could possibly be the same. Okay, so one person asks if you have a favorite of all your novels, and another person says, I haven't read Diane's books and came because Joanna so highly recommends them. Which book? My friends, like, I am constantly going on, and as you can tell, which book should I start with? So what would you say?
I can't answer that. I just don't know. My favorite usually is my most recently born. So at the moment, I'm very fond of Lorna, but I was also very fond of Lulu in Marrakesh, which other people weren't so that fond of. But in my mind, Lulu was a reincarnation of Izzy from Le Divorce.
Mm-hmm.
Now she's become a CIA agent. So I have this whole fabric and fantasy connections of characters, and they don't necessarily make it into the book, but it makes me fond of my characters and think of them as sort of
I love
my
that
family.
book. I also love
Good.
Persian Nights. I feel like it's a good,
Yeah.
I don't know, if just thinking of what people can start with. I suppose most
That's
people.
a good place to start, actually, if they're interested in Iran. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm just going to show you guys my bookshelf. A lot of people, so this is my office, and I always have in my office the Diane's Paris trilogy, which you can kind of see in the distance. And oddly, next to a novel by Eden Lepucki called California. So, but so there you go. But those are a good place to start too, I think.
Maybe divorce, marriage, affair.
Yeah, and I feel like Lorna Mott is a great one to read after those three, in a way, because there's
Lorna should be. Yeah, Lorna is not the place to start. That's right.
Just
I don't know why, but why not? But maybe it's okay.
I think it's a fine place to start. But someone asks, did the shadow nose lead to The Shining?
Yes, it did, very directly. Kubrick read it, and he was looking for a way to make a horror film. He was interested in that whole genre. And so he read it, and he read the Stephen King that became The Shining, or was The Shining. And because the shadow nose is a first person, in other words, consisting in thoughts, and he just couldn't figure out a way of making it work. But he asked me to write the screenplay because, I don't know, because maybe he thought I would be more biddable than Stephen King. Maybe he liked me better. I don't know. But anyway, that was the story of that was that Kubrick was thinking of Stephen King and The Shadow Knows.
Wow, that I can think The Shadow Knows is a great film though, but maybe it was ahead of its
Well, several, great directors have tried to and kind of not been able to figure out around the problem of the voiceover or the interior voice. Sidney Pollack had it for a while. A couple of other people, Diane Keaton had it for a while, and I don't know. It's just people tried to make it work.
I
Maybe
have to
someone
think on
will
this.
one day. I wish they would.
I just wrote the screenplay for the film adaptation of my last book, and in a similar way, as in like me writing it overseen by the director.
Yeah.
And I'm looking for my next project, so maybe.
Yeah. Well,
but,
yeah.
okay, a final question in our last 2 minutes is from John Mansfield, who asks what your favorite classic novels are.
Oh, that's an intimidating question.
I know that's the worst. No offense, John Mansfield. That's like the hardest question ever.
Oh, great. I loved The Good Soldier. I love a novel by Nigel Dennis called A House in Order. I always mention that when I can. Dodie Smith, I mentioned it.
Oh yeah.
Has anyone ever read I Capture the Castle, which is so adorable?
Of course.
I mean, these aren't great classics, but they're kind of not so familiar. Great classic. What would my very favorite be? Well, the novels of Jane Austen. Pride and Prejudice and Emma above all, but all of them would be, I would have to say, my really go-to desert island novels.
And I just would direct the John Mansfield, who asked this question, and anyone else who's interested in, Diane did the New York Times book reviews by the book interview a couple weeks ago, and she talks a lot about her favorite books.
Yeah, well, those are the things that I mentioned because they were fresh in my mind.
Yeah, and but it's a great interview, and I don't know if maybe Chelsea can put it in the chat or what have you, but it's pretty easy to find on the Times website.
Yeah, it's easy just Googling by the book, and then I think there's a list of the different authors that have done that particular feature.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Diane, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for coming. This was so incredible. I wish we could talk for another hour.
Thank you, Joanna. It has been very nice to see you again. And good luck with your screenplay. Please let me know about, will it be made?
Oh, it's made.
It's made.
Yeah.
Oh,
it's made.
What's it called?
And it's not out in France yet. It's come out actually all over. It has a distributor in France, but they just haven't released it because of the pandemic.
Well, it's been a bad time. Yeah.
Yeah, so they actually set 3 different release dates and then changed them, and it's driving my French publisher mad.
I bet. Yes.
But yeah, it's out in the US and the UK and all over the world. Just not France. So
great, but I'll be able to see it in this summer when I come back to San Francisco.
Yeah.
Okay,
yes.
That's great. Yeah. Congratulations.
Oh gosh.
That's a feat, really, to get something actually made out.
Yeah, I know. I guess you're right. Yeah. It is. I actually, you get so mired in the day-to-day stuff of it that you do forget. Thank you for saying that. It's true. Yes. Yeah. It had a big star attached to it, so that helped a lot. And so, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both so much for coming. I think I speak for everybody when I say I wish we had more time. And I do want to apologize. We're a couple minutes late getting started. We had some technical difficulties, and I think everybody in the age of Zoom understands what that's like. But thank you for sticking around and for your patience. We so appreciate it. And because we were a little short on time, I gave the briefest anemic bios. I did not give either of these wonderful authors their due, but we do have their books at politics-prose.com. Lorna Mott Comes Home, of course. I've put the link in the chat, and I see Sarah's thankfully put the link for Buy the Book in there. So check out both of those things, if you will. And also, if you're on the politics-pros.com website, you can check out a calendar of events. We hope to see you all at another event soon. In the meantime, stay well, everyone, and stay well read. Thank you, ladies, so much. What a great conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Joanna.
Thank you, Diane. This was such a pleasure.
It absolutely was. You made it so much fun.